Hello and welcome to the Business of Winning podcast, brought to you by Performance Insights, providing expert speakers and hosts from the world of Formula One motor racing to corporate events and conferences worldwide. Just click on www.performanceinsights.co.uk and send us your requirements.
Hello, and you're most welcome to this, the latest episode of the Business of Winning podcast with me, Mark Gallagher. I hope you've been listening to this new series. This is episode number 3. Of course, in our first episode, just a couple of weeks ago, we had Mark Priestley, former McLaren World Championship winning mechanic, who was talking about his new book, Pit Lane Lessons. Last week, we had Marcin Bukowski, a Polish-French engineer who led the Alpine Formula One team until 2021. And of course now continues to work in Formula One, broadcasting for Formula One on Polish television. A really interesting guy who, quite frankly, I mean, he's still a young guy, a young man to me anyway, and what an incredible career he has had working with some of the big names in Formula One of the last 25 years. And before I get into talking about our guest on this latest episode, let me just say, of course, we're recording this in the aftermath of a thrilling Las Vegas Grand Prix. A thrilling Grand Prix for Max Verstappen's fans, possibly slightly less thrilling for anyone who supports the McLaren drivers. And as we go into the final 2 races of the 2025 Formula One season, this is really going to be a game all about pressure. All about the degree of focus that those 3 drivers can bring to the task in hand, which frankly means that any one of the 3 of them, Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris or Max Verstappen, could win the World Championship for drivers. This is all about mental strength, and whilst all 3 drivers are physically very fit, and whilst all 3 drivers are extremely good and extremely fast Formula One drivers, this now becomes all about the mental game and also their overall, I suppose, well-being, their ability to block out distractions, their ability to deal with whatever happens to them over the course of these next couple of weekends, the mental strength and resilience they have, and how they can approach these last couple of races and go into them knowing they can win the World Championship rather than just hoping they can win the World Championship. So this is all about well-being, about mental strength and fitness and focus and all of the great things that you need as a driver at the pinnacle of world motorsport to go for the ultimate championship title. And that, of course, leads me to our guest on this week's episode, because just a few years ago when I was doing the Unibet podcasts with Mika Häkkinen, I remember him telling us on one of those episodes about the fact that his career trajectory was transformed by meeting the father of the guest who we're about to talk to this week, the father of Annastiina Hintsa, and that, of course, was Dr. Aki Hintsa. We'll talk a little bit more about Aki Hintsa during the course of this podcast. And Mika told me all about that tremendous difference that was made to his career just by taking the right approach to his overall mental focus, well-being, health, nutrition, fitness, all of those good things. So I hope you enjoy this interview with Annastiina Hintsa. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Hintsa Performance, founded, of course, by her father. And I'm sure you'll find some of her insights absolutely fascinating over the course of this conversation. So thanks for joining us and enjoy the chat. So Annastiina Hintsa, my goodness, I feel so privileged to have you on our podcast. I seem to have been talking about you and your company, Hintsa Performance, or maybe it's now just Hintsa, and of course your father, who we'll talk about. I've been talking about you for years, and of course Mika Häkkinen is a good friend to all of us at Performance Insights and has been on our podcast. So it's a real pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to you. And I just thought I would start by asking a kind of simple question, Annastiina. Tell us a little bit about Hintsa and the work that the company has done in Formula One and the kind of work that you do today.
Oh, thanks for having me, Mark. I'm really, really excited to be here too. So the feeling is mutual. The feeling is very much mutual.
Good.
Super briefly about Hintsa, and I think we have had this conversation before. We're not necessarily the ones that are known, but we have been in the sport for now next year coming to 30-year anniversary since my dad met Mika Häkkinen in 1996. So it's been a while that we've been involved in the sport from that human point of view. So I think the best way to summarize what it is that we do as Hintsa, especially in the context of F1, is we're responsible for making sure that the driver, when he gets in that car, is ready to race. That's what we do. Mentally, physically, making sure that the driver is ready to race. That's our kind of main focus. In addition to the driver, we do some work with teams. We have been doing some work even in factories, so we have sort of expanded because we know that Formula One is a team sport still. But yeah, that would be in short what we do.
So talk to me a little bit about, I mean, you mentioned your father, Dr. Aki Hintsa. Some of our, can I say, slightly older listeners who would have been following Formula One during Mika Häkkinen's career would know the name only too well. I mean, your father, Aki, was so well known. I had the privilege of meeting him. I was at the Jordan team at the time. Can you tell me a little bit about your father's background? How did he end up actually working in this Formula One environment? Because back in the 1990s, it wasn't a natural thing for this kind of territory to enter into Formula One.
No, I don't think so at all. I think in fact, him and Mika working together was something pretty unique at the time. So my dad, as his background, he was an orthopedic surgeon. He was the chief medical officer for the Finnish Olympic Committee. He was a doctor who always had a soft spot for sports. His original dream was to be an ice hockey player, and then maybe for the benefit of everyone, he never actually pursued that career to the end. Instead, he became he would not like me saying that but instead he ended up becoming a doctor, and particularly a doctor focused on sports and athlete performance. And that's, I think, the reason why when Mika had his accident in Adelaide in 1995, he reached out to my dad. And my dad was the one that then helped him, was part of the people. I know that Mika had a lot of people around him that actually helped him make the phenomenal recovery that he did. But my dad was definitely a part of that core team, helping Mika then make the comeback into Formula One, go on to win his first race, and then obviously go on to win 2 world championships against Michael Schumacher. So that's sort of the short story of how Hintsa got involved in Formula One.
Now, a few years ago, Mika was talking to me, I think on another podcast. We were discussing, his career trajectory, and Mika, he actually surprised me because I've known Mika since he was 18 years of age, and I had forgotten that for the first 7 years he was in Formula One, he didn't win anything. And he suddenly told me this story about how he'd been in Formula One, hadn't been winning, it was beginning to struggle. He was beginning to struggle. So then he sits down with your father and has this conversation. And your father says to him, "Tell me what's happening in your life." And Mika, I think Mika told me he spent 2 hours sort of saying everything that was happening. At the end of which Aki Hintsa says to Mika, "Well, I'm not really surprised you're not winning because you've just spent 2 hours telling me about all the things that are in your head, and none of it is to do with focusing on winning in Formula One. I mean, you've got so many other distractions going on." So I thought that was a really interesting story. And he said the big thing that actually Aki Hintsa helped him to do was to take this holistic approach to being a potential world champion. So exactly what you said at the beginning, physical, yes, but actually mental approach as well. So to what extent do you, Annastiina, see this in the work that Hintsa does with companies and with teams in Formula One? Is that whether in sport or business, people are just unable to do what's needed to focus on the success. There are so many things that get in the way of that success. So to what extent do you see that?
I think that's huge, Mark, actually. I think it's one of the biggest things, and I love that story too, by the way, that Mika tells, because I think it
Yeah.
does reflect in many ways sort of, it reflects the insanely complex reality of what it is to compete in Formula One. and all of the things that come with it, all of the pressures, all of the stakeholders that you're constantly managing. And I would even argue that for some of the young guys now, it's even more challenging with social media and being basically on camera 24/7, sort of having so many different people in so many different parts of your life, that just want a piece of you basically. And I think that's something that very much also resonates. So in addition to Formula One, and maybe go back to your first question to answer a little bit what it is that what's the work that we do right now. So when you look at the paddock, any given year, hence performance, we're coaching or supporting 60-70% of the drivers any given year. That's roughly where we are. In the last since Mika's days, we have won 19 world championships, or Hintsa supported drivers have won 19 world championships, and in the last decade, over 90% of race victories. So we call it sort of like our human test laboratory. And what surprised me when I got involved in the sport for the first time, was how many of those lessons actually do translate. So there are quite a few things that do translate. I think this point about focus, and not just focus, but really honing in on what we call your core. So the method that my dad developed, actually originally working with long distance runners in Ethiopia, which is again maybe part of the unusual story of how he got involved in the sport. He used to work with Haile Gebrselassie, who is one of the best long distance runners of all time. And with Haile, he was inspired to really think about what it is that makes you not just perform at the top of your sport, but to do so sustainably over the long term. What are sort of foundations of resilience? And he developed this method that he called the circle of success, starting with what he would call your core. And that core really is about identifying, do you know who you are? What are the pillars of your identity that help you, not just perform your best at whatever it is that you do, but actually bounce back and be resilient in times of setback. So in Haile's case, it was, he is obvious being a runner is a huge part of who he is, but it's only one part of his identity. He's a father, he's a businessman, he's an active community member, he coaches young athletes, etc. So there are these areas that you do want to keep, a part of your life, you do want to be aware of. The second question, and when it comes to a Formula One driver, the way he would phrase it is, who are you when you're no longer a Formula One driver? What are the things that cannot be taken away from you? And if you imagine any of the young guys being asked that question, they get kind of confused because, this is who I am and this is who I want to be. But it is actually equally important for us to think about sort of what else there is in our lives that actually matters. And once we have identified that, it's easier for us then to also declutter the rest of it. The second question my dad would ask is, do you know what you want? And that's as important as it is to define what does success mean to you on track. We have to define what success means to us off track. So again, in the case of an executive client that we have, many of us are very, very well aware of how did we define, success in terms of our corporate careers. On a quarterly basis, we're being followed up on a number of OKRs and KPIs and whatnot, P&L, stock price. And I think it's very easy for us to define how we define success in a professional setting. But how many of us have actually taken a step back and thought about how do we define success more holistically in our life? What do we want that to look like? And again, that's about honing in and defining your focus. What are the things that actually matter to you? And then the final piece is around control. And we've had so many discussions about this also recently, both with our sports clients, where that notion of control is very much linked to the psychology of resilience. So when you have so many uncontrollables, when you're driving the car, there are a lot of things that are not exactly in your control. What are the things that you can control in that moment? Focusing really on focusing on what you can control. And the same goes for our executive clients. So yes, there's a lot of things, there's a lot of noise, there are a lot of things we cannot really influence, but what are the things that you can actually control so that you make sure you are on the driver's seat of your own life and not like a passenger.
Gosh, there's so much in what you just said in those last few moments. I'm not going to name his name, but I sat down with a young driver who's now in Formula One 2 years ago, and he talked to me about the fact that he was going to go into Formula One, and I said, nothing prepares you for what's about to happen, because if you've been in Formula 2, you think the step is like a small step. And I said it's like going from local school football to competing in the Champions League final. It's just, I said, nothing's going to prepare you for the complexity, for the noise, for all the different demands on your time. And I've watched as this driver has, I mean, he has really struggled. And I mean, I don't think he'll have a long career in Formula One because he came in completely unprepared. And you mentioned social media. I mean, social media is now so, social media, it kills careers so quickly because you get a narrative around you. And then, of course, the worst thing of all is you see the young drivers then they get upset because of what's on social media. So then they reply to it, and then suddenly there's a public argument going on, and you look at it and you think exactly like you said, Annastiina. Professional sports stars today have lots of additional layers of complexity on their lives, which they have to worry about. So there's so much to unpack from what you just said. Let's just take a little let's just take a little bit of a step away from Formula One and say you're now talking to a busy executive, someone who is running a business, maybe running a function within a business, maybe responsible for international markets. So they're jumping on a plane every 2 days. They have a ton. They have the boss telling them that the shareholders expect, really good Q1 results. And by the way, next year we have the most ambitious target ever because we're planning an IPO in 2 years' time. And I see this, I see it, and I hear it all the time when I do events.
Yeah.
So how does Hintsa help under pressure executives to deal with what they are facing in their lives, which there are parallels to high performing sports people.
There are parallels to high-performing sports people, especially if you think about performing under pressure sustainably and in what we would often call suboptimal circumstances. So what you just mentioned there about flying around the world, having all these stakeholders, having that do more with less. Sound familiar to anyone?
Yeah.
So I think, and
Yeah.
then having all these uncontrollables, like who knows, let me slap a tariff on you or whatnot. So there's a lot happening in the global markets too, which is again out of your control. Similar to weather for a Formula One driver, not exactly in your control. So I think there are definitely parallels that do resonate. And again, for the executives, we would actually start with the same three core questions: defining who you are, what are actually the pillars of your identity, what matters to you, defining success, explicitly defining success on and off the track, and then defining the things that you can really control, the things that are in the sphere of your control, so that you can regain some of that agency that I'm always kind of blown away by. You would think that the people at the top of the pyramid have all the control, and in reality many of them actually feel that they're just reacting. They're in a reactive state, not exactly driving things, but in a reactive state, taking whatever comes to them. So it really starts with those three questions. And then on top of that, what we talk about is a couple of things. So if you imagine those as the core of a circle, at the outside are 6 different elements of health and well-being that impact basically your energy and capacity to perform at that moment, both your physical performance, but also your mental and your cognitive performance. And especially now that we're thinking in the age of Gen AI, et cetera, I think a lot of those core human skills, complex problem solving, creativity, contextualization, judgment, relationship, emotional intelligence, a lot of those are actually the outcome, a direct outcome of how you show up in the room, how you show up in the moment. What's your energy and capacity in that given moment? And if we're constantly sleep deprived, jet lagged, chronically stressed, and not feeling great, it doesn't take an expert to tell you that you're not necessarily getting the best out of yourself, and you as a leader tend to have a cascading impact on your organization. So it's not a great recipe. So what we would then do with the executives is, it's a very simple format of diagnose, plan, act, measure, same as anywhere. We'd start by understanding where you are across those different elements. We talk about physical activity, nutrition, biomechanics, mental energy or performance psychology. We talk about sleep and recovery, and general health. And all of those, I know that I went through that list super fast. I'm happy to share it
That's all
again if
right.
need be. But the idea is that you look at all of the different components of your mental and physical health and well-being as a foundation for that sustainable performance long term. And we would literally go as far as, try and identify the smallest thing that you could change that would have the biggest cascading impact on that system.
Okay.
Because I think one of the key things we find with executives is that we all know what we should be doing. The challenge is actually getting it done. You know exactly how you should be eating and sleeping and planning for your travels to the US and Australia next week and all. You know exactly what you should be doing. The challenge is what we would call in research the intention to action gap. How do you bridge it?
Yeah.
And how do you bridge it over and over again so that it actually becomes something that's more of a sustainable operating model as opposed to a one-off?
Yeah, you're 100% right. See, I know that I should be hydrating tonight because I'm flying tomorrow, but in truth, I
There we
can't
go.
wait for my glass of wine tonight. And I'm not sure how that fits in, but it's really interesting because one of the things I wanted to ask you about was the scientific approach that your colleagues take to this, because you mentioned all of those areas, rapid fire. You mentioned all those areas to do with well-being, and yet the reality is you can measure so much of it and actually show people this is where you are at. So again, there's a parallel there. Formula One is obsessed with data and information that creates actions, to improve performance. And Hintsa take exactly the same approach, don't you, with athletes and with business people?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what kind of things can you measure, for example?
I think this is like one of the, so we, maybe for context again, and this didn't come up before, but obviously my father actually passed away in 2016, and we just recently had made a 10-year anniversary edition of a book that he wrote about the method and about his work in Formula One, etc., called The Core. And as we were kind of reviewing the material and reviewing the science, reviewing the method, I think the one thing that sort of struck me as the biggest difference is actually our ability to measure the abundance of data that we had. Again, I'm going back to the fact that I think there still is oftentimes that intention to action gap from the data to actual habit creation. Like what do you do with the data? How do you make sure that you don't get into analysis paralysis with the data? How do you make sure that you don't become too reliant on the data? That's maybe another tangent to go on. But in short, what we would do in the beginning of any program, either with the executives or with the athletes, is baseline assessments. And that would cover anything from medical assessments. So that's your labs, that's your, scans, that's a general health checkup where we would take a preventative approach. So not just looking at where you are right now, but thinking, okay, if you keep on this trajectory, what does your health span look like in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years? For a Formula One driver, is actually very important also in the context of their career, because that's not a given. What does your spine look like when you retire from F1, etc. If you keep this trajectory. The other thing that we will do is we do physical assessments. So that's everything from your VO2 max and your strength and your biomechanics screen, etc. So how is your body working? And again, with that sort of a similar approach. If this is where you are right now, these are the habits that you have at the moment. This is how you're looking after yourself at the moment. What does your trajectory look like? Are we sort of in 10 years time or 20 years time or in your marginal decade? What are the things you want to be able to do, and how are you preparing for that right now? And then of course there's psychometrics that you can do. So in terms of your mindsets, your behaviors, etc., that's something that we can also measure. And then I'm sure well, a lot of the listeners and certainly a lot of our executives, and I would say almost all of well, practically all of our athlete clients will be wearing some kind of wearable or two or three constantly. Well, there we go. Exactly. We all are. And I think that's one of those like the biggest changes that we've had. Again, not just the ability to measure, but also how accurate it is has improved tremendously. But I think therein lies also a danger. So I literally had a client that I spoke to last week, and I was like, we had a morning meeting, and I was like, yeah, how did you sleep? And his response was, "Let me check." So it was sort of one of those moments where we can't even respond to, like, how did you sleep, without checking my phone and my app to see whether my readiness score was, I don't know, 67 or 80, 84. So we're kind of we're I think we're going to see two things here. I think we're still going to see more in terms of the data, and especially sort of from data to insight and action, or actionable recommendations. I think that's something that we're seeing more and more of, especially with the new tools coming online. At the same time, I'm almost starting to see a little bit of a pendulum swing too. So there are actually, myself included, I use data to recalibrate. I don't use it all the time, because I want to make sure that there is also that ability for me to tune in and listen to my body and actually feel how I am in this moment, as opposed to just measure my continuously measure my glucose levels and heart rate variability. It's an interesting field.
See, I find it's really interesting what you said, because because I think maybe because I worked in Formula One and have this interest in data, I look at my wearable and I look at all of the data that I can quite often, and I sometimes can get hung up on that data. I can kind of think, oh, I can see a trend. I don't like that trend, or how do I change this? Change it. So it's really interesting. And I remember probably a decade ago being invited by GE Healthcare to come and speak at a conference. And I told them how we instrument a Formula One car and gather all this data, and then how the data is transmitted from wherever we are in the world back to headquarters. And we have a team of engineers analyzing every system. And I said, like, to be honest, there's no reason you couldn't do that with a human body. And we ended up having a big discussion in that meeting. And I was really interested, because some of the people were saying, well, what about the confidentiality of all the data? And I said, well, yeah, but like, if someone gave me a wearable that meant that I could help extend my lifespan because I was able to do something about certain things, then why would you not want the information? So it's a, and of course it's moving so quickly. You mentioned, Gen AI. I mean, we're now in this accelerating world of data and insights and what you can do with it. So presumably for a Hintsa, therefore, part of the challenge is knowing how to create that ideal interface between the technology and the data that's available, and then, as you said, the human element. Like, how do you feel? How are you sleeping? How do you feel about yourself? Your energy levels, that kind of. So there's a kind of an objective and a subjective quality in some ways too.
Absolutely, and we do actually both still. And if you speak to our sleep experts, they still highlight both. Sleep is an easy one, because I think that's one where, again, we've seen a big advancement in terms of how our ability to measure sleep, both quality, consistency, and quantity of sleep. And I think that's one of the areas where our experts still say that, irrespective of what your app or variable says, it's actually important for you to ask yourself that question: how do I feel? Like, did I sleep well or not? How energetic do I feel in the morning is still something that our coaches would regularly ask. And I would sort of build on that still one notch more. So I think, to your point, like, am I seeing a trend? What am I gonna do about that trend? So there is that whole data, insights from data. So not just the abundance of data, but actually, what do I see in this? What's actually important for me personally to take from this? And then I think there's a third piece, which is really like, how do I turn this data into something that's an actionable recommendation? Like, how do I bridge the intention to action gap? Data can be hugely helpful, but if data were enough, we'd all be billionaires with perfect six packs.
Now, if I was to say to someone today that I was speaking to Annastiina Hintsa from Hintsa about high performance coaching, they would immediately think that I was talking to you about Formula One drivers in the gym, physically training, and they wouldn't realize about all the other stuff that you do. And you've already touched on a number of them. So nutrition, hydration, sleep. I mean, let's take sleep. So again, I'm about to head off on a crazy round the world trip, America, Australia, whatever. lots of executives face that. I mean, you quite often meet executives who are responsible for a region like the whole of Europe or EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa, or Asia Pacific. So lots of executives traveling to multiple countries. How does Hintsa equip executives to deal with things like jet lag, sleep patterns, nutrition? I mean, do you give them? I mean, do you literally give them a guideline, say go and do that? How does that work?
Mark, do you have a jet lag plan for your travel?
I have a kind of personalized jet lag plan, and by the way, it doesn't involve wine.
Good.
Okay, I don't rely on alcohol for my jet lag plan. Okay, I rely. So my approach to it is hydration and sleep, and getting into the time zone that
Yeah.
you're going to. And
Yes.
I've become much better at it over the years. And I had a cardiologist of all people tell me one day that the worst thing that I could do would be to go into the lounge and have a glass of champagne every time I flew, because he said, Mark, we see people in my cardio unit. So this guy was based in Dubai, and he said the biggest feeder of the hospital in Dubai is Emirates Airlines. He said our hospitals are full of busy travelers who have drunk alcohol, got on flights, had bad sleep, and they end up with atrial fibrillation, or they end up with, some heart. And he said it's all got to do with a complete imbalance. It was one of the most useful conversations I ever had, because he said, it's good to have a glass of champagne when you're going on holiday once a year. But he said, if you're flying 3 times a week, you cannot be fueling that with alcohol. You've got to fuel that with sleep, hydration. You've got to look after your well-being. You've got to think about what your body's having to go through. And so that very short conversation with him, actually, for me, was a changer. And I'm sure those are then the kind of areas that you get involved in.
Absolutely. Let's kind of all of the areas you mentioned earlier. So in addition to the gym is actually a pretty minor part of it. There is the nutrition, there's the hydration, there's biomechanics, which is really about, your body's ability to move the way it's intended to. There's performance psychology, which is actually huge nowadays, and that's an area that we've seen an increase in uptake on, also in our with our motorsport clients, but very very relevant for our executive clients too. And then obviously sleep and recovery. I always get asked, like, out of all these elements that you're optimizing for, with the Formula One drivers, what's the one that would have the biggest impact, or what's the one that your executives clients struggle with the most? And typically it is sleep and recovery, jet lag. I think part of that is due to the fact that we just have this weird relationship with sleep, where we think that that's the one thing we can always deprioritize, or the one thing that we trade off the easiest. I mean, we're always making trade-offs when it comes to we call it navigating this well-being and performance paradox. Like we will always, there's no way of getting out of it. You will be making trade-offs in your day-to-day. The trick is, we're not always conscious of those trade-offs that we're making. And sleep in particular is one of the trade-offs that we tend to make day in, day out. And we're compromising on it. We stop realizing the impacts. Similar to your conversation with the doctor about jet lag, and if you don't mind, I'll give you an example. So I actually remember I had a similar conversation with Professor Stephen Lockley from Harvard, who is an expert in jet lag management and sleep, and he he showed me this case study or this research paper from Van Doken. I use it all the time because it was just such an eye opener, from Van Doken et al. From 2004, where they looked at 4 groups of people and they measured their sleep depth and their cognitive performance for 2 weeks in a row. One of them was sleeping for 8 hours a night, one for 6, one for 4, and then one poor group, they had to stay up for 2 nights in a row. And then they measured their reaction times as a proxy for cognitive performance. And what they found out was 2 main things. One was that sleep depth accumulates and it impairs your performance. So over the course of the weeks, obviously the ones that were sleeping for 6 hours or less, their performance declined faster the less you slept. The other and an interesting piece there was that by the end of the 6-week period, the group that had been sleeping for 6 hours a night for 2 weeks in a row, their performance decline was equivalent to the group that had stayed up for 2 nights, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. So if you're consistently getting 6 hours per night And even if you try and catch up, catch up over the weekend, I'm sorry, that doesn't really work. It will it will not counter the effect. Your performance decline could be equivalent to staying up for 2 nights in a row. The second key finding in the same study, they asked the participants about their self-rated or self-perceived sleepiness. Like, how sleepy do you feel? And for the first couple of nights, the guys that were sleeping for 6 hours a night, they were like, yeah, I'm feeling groggy, I don't feel so well. After that, it plateaued. So we basically get used to performing suboptimally. If we're always compromising on sleep, we get used to performing suboptimally. Our brain adjusts. And I think that for me was like, because I used to think I belonged to the category that needs, 6 hours is a good night. Reality is I'm probably just used to being chronically sleep deprived. And I think that sort of especially with executives who are not just traveling, but they're also often part of a global team. So you're part of a, executive leadership team or whatever team you are, and your team is actually in different time zones. Your clients, are in different time zones. So it's a combination of jet lag management, and shifting time zones, and it's a combination of travel fatigue. And we have three things that we would work on. So number one is, pre-flight. How do you prepare? Sounds like you have your plan in place, so that's good. It really is about adjusting beforehand, about 1 hour per time zone per day, what you can adjust. You will use Zeitgebers, so what are the cues for your brain and your body, for your body clock to adjust. So that most important one's light. When you see the drivers, with their shades in the airports, that's not just because they're so cool. Or when it go incognito, it's actually a performance strategy for jet lag management. The second piece is what you do during the flight. So here, keeping a little bit physically active, having a clear strategy in terms of food or nutrition, and then very importantly, hydration. I think that for me was sort of one of those, again, moments when the coin dropped, when I realized that yes, always when I'm flying, I feel super dehydrated. And the reason is that the air humidity, if on the ground we're talking about 40 to 60% humidity levels normally, Singapore is more, Abu Dhabi will be less, but on average, that's what we're talking about. On air, it's 5 to 10%. So it's actually, the air is extremely dry, which means that we should be drinking roughly 250 milliliters per hour of flight. And that's a lot of water. And when I say drinking, not wine, water and electrolytes preferably. Wine obviously has a counter effect. And then finally, there's what you do after you arrive. So how do you get then kind of adjust for or prepare yourself for your peak performance moment once you have arrived in your destination?
There's so many areas that we can talk about here. I'm really, what one point that you touched on, which I'm very interested in, is, and I see this with Formula One drivers, but actually, I think I've also seen it with successful executives, is their ability to build good habits and and habit forming. And I think you touched on the fact that with one of the things you can do with people is to see where they're at, and then you can take a plan. You can say over the next, if you keep on doing what you're doing, this is what's going to happen. I mean, in some ways, that's quite frightening. We can now look years ahead, but there's got to be a truth in that. How can Hintsa help people to adopt positive habits? Because it's not easy to change, and especially if you're a successful executive, let's say you're in your 40s or maybe your 50s, you've already had 20 or 30 years of your adult career life. How do you then set about changing, and how can Hintsa help you to do that?
I think the first point really is establishing that baseline, understand where you are, and then really looking at the system holistically. So you wouldn't, like, a lot of times we tend to focus on one single area. Like you said, like when you think of a performance coach at Hintsa, you think of them with the driver at the gym, and you think it's only about physical activity. And when we talk about physical activity, often we zone in even deeper. We go like, we have executives that are very, very, into Ironmans or endurance sports, but then their strength training is actually quite poor, et cetera, et cetera. So what we would look at is the system as a whole. And the first thing that we would try and do is identify where in the system do we have the biggest lever of change in terms of cascading impact. So that really is number one. Quite often it is around your sleep, as an example. Or it could be around nutrition, it could be around physical activity, it could be around your morning routine, it could be around detachment, cognitive, mental detachment after work, like mental recovery strategies. But what we would try and do is identify where in this model is the thing that we should be focusing on. Because I think one of the challenges for us as leaders or executives too is, and actually equally for our athletes, you take a Formula One driver and you'll have your physio, your nutritionist, your sleep and recovery expert, your driving coach, your performance coach, or your essence strength and conditioning coach. You'll have your manager, your team principal, your race engineer, your girlfriend, your father, etc. And everyone will have an opinion on what you should be focusing on right now. With us, it's more like we get all this information fed to us through social media and other means in terms of what it is that you should be doing right now. What's the magic pill that will change everything? And oftentimes it's not just, that there's a lot of it, it's often conflicting too in terms of advice. So our job really is to make, again, sense of that picture as a whole and identify that one thing that you could change. And I'd say change deliberately. So it's not about necessarily adding a lot of things for you to do. It is actually about thinking, how are there things that I could do slightly differently that don't necessarily take up any more of my time, but things that I could do slightly differently. And then very importantly, when it comes to habit change, how can I engineer my environment to support that change? We all see these people who we think like, oh my God, they have everything under control and they have this amazing self-control. And they get up every morning at 4:30 or 5 a.m. They do their gym session and their cold shower, and then they before we get started with our workday, they've already done half of theirs. It's it's that stereotype of the person that seems to have everything always under control and more hours in a day than the rest of us mere mortals. And with those people, what the research actually says is it's not that they have a better sense self-control. It's actually that they deploy it less. They engineer their environment so that when they're in that moment when they need to make a decision about the trade-off in terms of real well-being, they're actually not faced with it at all because they've already made the decision beforehand and they've basically taken the options away. So that it's not even an option for me to make the quote-unquote bad choice, and it's as easy as possible for me to make the good choice. That makes sense.
That makes a lot of sense. You're making me feel good. I have to say, I read about things like the 5 a.m. club. My 5 a.m. experience is I hit the snooze button. I'm not getting up at 5 a.m. for anybody. But it is very interesting to talk about these habits and how people can create if you like, their own ecosystem within which they can perform better and they look after themselves. Let me ask you. Let me go back to the Formula One piece because you mentioned all those World Championship titles that have been won by drivers working with Hintsa over the last 25 years, and I mean it's been an extraordinary journey. I will save you your blushes and say to listeners, Hintsa have worked with people like Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton, and I mean you don't need to say much more than that. Drivers who have dominated within the sport. Is there something that Hintsa have identified separates the good from the great? And I'm talking about now all the people you work with, not just Formula One drivers. Is there a certain type of person who responds better to performing under pressure? Is it something you can learn, or is it something that's inherent to those people?
I think so. My answer to that would be both and.
Okay.
So there are a lot of traits that can be learned.
Yeah.
Resilience is a skill that can be learned.
Yeah.
And when you think about the high performers, I think one sort of unifying factor across the board, be it in business or be it in Formula One, is that these individuals, these high performing individuals, are extremely resilient in their craft. It's when you are performing under high stakes consistently, it does mean that you are also consistently faced with failures, things that you can improve on, or things that go wrong. And you do need to be very, very resilient as an individual. And resilience is not a trait. It's actually it's a skill that can be learned. So that one I think is one factor. The other one I think is there is a certain drive and a growth mindset, or a willingness to continuously improve and learn, that I think does set the greats apart from the very good. And that goes to both learning from your, reframing and learning from those moments of failure or, setbacks, as well as actually learning and wanting to still improve even when you win the championship. I could give you examples. We don't really name clients, but I could give you examples of drivers who would, just, spray the champagne and get back with the engineers and start talking about like what should we do differently for next year, and literally what can we learn from this race for the future. And I think that sort of that mindset of continuously wanting to improve, learn, grow is something that really sets apart.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point in which to end, because whether it's in Formula One or in business, to be successful requires a huge amount of effort and continued effort and hard work at it. And so you need that foundation of resilience, because most of the time you're just having to work hard to solve problems and get to where you want to get to. And then I love that point that you made about continuous improvement, because I think that for me, that's what Formula One's all about. We have an obsession with continuous improvement, and drivers like Mika, or drivers like, I don't know, Max or Lando, or any of the drivers we care to think about, they always want to know, how can I do better? And that I find really interesting. They never really get to a point where they think they've cracked it. They always feel that there's more room to come. Annastiina, thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. Great to talk to you. And by the way, how can listeners find Hintsa? How do we go about finding Hintsa as a company?
So hintsa.com, Hintsa. That's
okay.
Hintsa.com. That's the easiest way to find us, or via LinkedIn.
And I know that on there you have some really nice case studies and testimonials and links, and you've got some great YouTube videos as well with some of your performance coaches and experts talking about the different areas. So for any listeners out there, if you're a busy business person, or you're a prospective Formula One driver or athlete and you want to tap into the best in the business, go to hintsa.com. And thanks once again, Annastiina. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It was a real pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Annastiina Hintsa. I thought it was fascinating to hear about the lessons that have been learned within high performance world of Formula One, and how those can apply to the world of high pressure business, and frankly for all of us who have really busy lifestyles and very often get distracted by the pressures that we're under and don't look after ourselves perhaps as well as we should. Hintsa is a force to be reckoned with. You can find them at hintsa.com. That's HINTSA.com. They also have an Instagram feed, always posting things on there. Also on LinkedIn, they can be found. And they have a YouTube channel, and you can watch some really interesting interviews with some of their key personnel. And I'm sure, like me, you'd find some really interesting takeaways from that. If you want to learn a little bit more about our company, Performance Insights, you can find us at performanceinsights.co.uk. We also have an Instagram feed for Performance Insights, and also on LinkedIn. But thank you once again for listening to the Business of Winning podcast. We will be bringing you the next episode between the penultimate and the final rounds of this year's Formula One World Championship battle. I'm sure we're in for a thrilling weekend in Qatar. I hope you enjoy that as much as I'm looking forward to, and we'll be back speaking with you very soon. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe to the Business of Winning podcast. And if you want to learn more about Performance Insights, simply visit our website at performanceinsights.co.uk, providing expert speakers and hosts from the world of Formula One motor racing to corporate events and conferences worldwide.